objective optimization under uncertainty. And so, which actually brings me to the question of what is robustness or what is optimality, and all of these kinds of mathematical definitions when you try to put them into the pesky thing that is the real world. So, and the other person I want to call out here is because I was listening to Greg and listening to some of the talks on the first day, so I actually kind of tailored this a little bit and brought my former PhD and currently J-Lone colleague at Davis, John Herman, some of the work that he and I did together towards the end of his PhD. So one of the interesting things that U.S. and outside of the U.S., particularly UK, Australia, this idea of robustness, the ubiquity of a term, seems to be highly correlated to having no definition, much like resilience. And so one of the interesting things that I see is actually I see utilities being more interested in multiple futures than academics these days. And so this is one of the reports. There are a lot of case studies. I've actually given briefings to the Metropolitan Water District and a variety of others. So there's a lot of discussion, and part of the discussion is what exactly are we discussing? What is robustness? How do you do these decision making? Everybody says the word trade-off. Very few people actually explicitly understand what the trade-offs are in their systems, and so it's challenges. And so to this point in my career, I'm kind of known as the guy that when they say what are the trade-offs, I've specialized in algorithmic and mathematical development and optimization, simulation under uncertainty kind of tools. And how do you encapsulate that? So we call this idea of mini objective visual analytics. And one of the big uncertainties, I would say, is that we actually don't know how to define the problems themselves, even at the systems analyst level. There's no magic person that comes in and tells the systems analyst how to correctly formulate the problem. They could be objectives, constraints, uncertainties, models, etc. And I do this as an iterative learning process, but if you do formulate these models, then one of the questions is, well, the first question here is, where is my well, if you want flexibility to be able to explore a lot of hypotheses here, then you need new tools that can solve these more complex, potentially evolving views of the problem. And then humans get involved, which is always problematic. And so this idea of it's easy to list these, negotiated design selection and interactive visualization. One of the things that we've been really focused on in the last 5 years is how do you actually blow these out? So what are, like this idea of a deep uncertainty, some people view this as an excuse for sloppiness, just to say, well, I could do statistics, or I'll just say deep uncertainty. That's not really what it is. Is the reality, say, how many of you know what climate sensitivity is? Anybody? So it's the temperature relationship with the doubling of CO2 beyond pre-industrial and equilibrium. So there's been somewhere on the order of over $100 million spent globally on that, because that's actually integral to every policy discussion in the world right now on how to intervene in climate change. And there are 48 published, highly reputed distributions for that one parameter, where you have ranges in effect measured in trillions of dollars. So that's an example of a deep uncertainty. Multiple potential distributions, high contention, very poor causal relationships. And so unfortunately for water, we have a lot of these kinds of things, and the demand, human response to demand. So one of the questions is, how do you deal with this in this kind of iterative process? And that's what we've been trying to figure out. So to distill that out, what my group likes to do, we want to try to help people rapidly explore multiple competing problem formulations or hypotheses. I view an instance of how you formulate a problem as a hypothesis. The next then is to facilitate learning and visual trade-off analysis about that hypothesis or multiple, and then figure out how you can actually facilitate real decisions that are implemented, such that you know when to actually deviate from what you've recommended. the system may actually not be in the state that you assume. But how quickly can you figure that out and respond? One of the things is, I thought Greg gave a great talk, and I've been very fortunate to work with him, and he gave, hopefully you recollect a little bit of this talk from Monday. So he did a very nice job of framing the financial instruments in this, and then he was kind enough to come up and ask Cornell and my team to say, hey, you know what, we have a lot of these levers that we can switch now in terms of how we do demand, how we do these decisions. Would you help us out on the multi-objective side? So again, just to set the context again, you have this issue where you have smaller populations that have an excess of supply, the potential for transfer, in a place that's supposed to have an abundance of water into perpetuity. And Greg highlighted that you have this kind of lack of balance between supply and demand, this potential for transfers, potential for financial instruments, and you have a multi-actor system, multi-jurisdictional, right? So, and in any given utility, to the extent that I understand it and talk to them, actually when you make a recommendation, there's probably no less than 40 other people, including legal, etc., that have to go through and understand that process. So how do you start making that discussion tangible? And so in this particular example, so Greg highlighted this idea of restrictions or demand management. So, and this is the only real instrument that they were using in the system, active demand management, before Greg's team got involved. So, and then one of the other interesting things that Greg's team has been doing, and there's been a shift, what if you're not optimizing exactly what somebody's going to do in 2024 on January 24th, which that level of prognostication is absurd, but actually you shift to this contextual dynamic of risk of failure where you're actually optimizing a rule, right? And that rule will give you a different action for different systems. Well, that's non-linear, it's extremely difficult, it's computationally intensive. So, and that's what this is an example. What risk of failure would we trigger restrictions? What risk of failure would we trigger water transfers? So now you have the pendulum where you're trying to actively deal with the efficiency of the system, both in terms of how they transfer the water or share the water and how they deal with demand, and then you bring in self-insurance or third-party insurance. These are all the decisions that Greg was highlighting. So what's interesting about this, you have 4 jurisdictions, and how they set this affects everybody, but not in a very clear way. Right? You have interdependent choice. Every one of the utilities has to set these dials, and every setting of the dials affects every other utility and overall the region. And so this is where the kinds of context where the multi-objective optimization that my team does comes in, is how do you actually think about searching through this and thinking about the objectives of the system? The other interesting thing is that sometimes it's good to talk to the people who run the systems what their actual objectives are, because they're different than what sometimes the analyst would assume. And so in this, what they told us is they want reliability, number of years for reservoir storage is greater than 20%, so they have a little factor of safety in the definition of reliability. And as usual, reliability is a threshold. Restriction frequency, this was a meeting, me, Greg, and HB and John Herman were in, and this is, I don't think this is an objective that we would have actually put in, but this was from the utilities. I believe it's both political and financial in this case. Average financial losses, as Greg highlighted on Monday, are different than worst case financial losses. So planning for the average is not the same as planning for the worst case. And there's good sound mathematics where you can actually prove that there's a variance transfer. Typically, when you optimize to the average, you do a variance transfer, and your worst case goes crazy. So, and here's an interesting thing. You have 4 players in this system. You're seeking a dynamic rule set. And you want to do well for the region without harming the individuals. So one of the questions was, how do we collapse all these individuals? And so actually what they were very keen on, they liked this equity issue. And what they said is basically, if the worst person's reliability is 99% and everybody else is 99% or better, we're happy with that. And so that's one of the first ways that we start tackling dimensionality. So this is where the hypothesis testing starts to come in. Using the math to start attacking assumptions. This is what they do in the status quo, restrictions only. And so if this works, then it's kind of boring. Greg and I wrote a nice proposal, have a lot of money, but we could basically stop and relax. But then there's transfers, self-insurance, and so this is actually, and there's a body coming out of France, actually, the constructive decision making, of how you build formulations interactively and learn how to formulate the problem with the folks that you're working with. And so to understand and how to separate these different problem formulations, it's good to talk about multi-objectives. So, and this is your quintessential water supply. You want high reliability, low cost. So I actually had the honor of getting invited by Kaveh Mandani, some of you, or most of you probably know him, at an Imperial workshop in February. It had people from all different sectors. One of my favorite was a guy from finance who stood up in London and he said, yeah, you academics are funny and neat, but none of this matters in the boardroom. And so my counter, because I got to speak right after him, is I said, yeah, but usually in the boardroom you don't have some cute person that stands up and says that your strategy is here, worse than everything. So as long as you're not transparent, everybody's happy. Right? And so thinking about this idea of domination, this actually resides pretty well with people. It's not difficult to not want to do worse than everything. The question is, we don't know what everything is. How we formulate the problem is itself probably the primary uncertainty that we lack. Understanding of or even a willingness to confront. So the same way, dominated region, so we call this average cost here, your reliability, average reliability. Each of these points is a water supply portfolio, so you get your marginal benefit of increasing. You want to stay out of the dominated region, so this is the essence of multi-objective optimization. So I'm just kind of curious here. This is as an experiment. This is 98%. This is 100%, which is a fallacy. 13 million, 9 million. I'm going to point to each of these. Raise your hand and keep your hand up when I point to a point that you think is reasonable. So, which means you'd be okay with this. You'd be willing to take this trade-off. The example here is 98.5% reliability is in this ballpark.
What happens if you fail?
So what happens? That's a good question.
Do I die? I mean, that's a big deal.
So reliability here is that reservoir falls below their factor of safety. So they're below their 20% factor of safety. So nobody's done.
Okay.
But it's a water supply. So they consider it critical, but you are an analyst. I'm just curious. I've done this about 5 times now with different audiences. All right, so raise your hand if I am at a point that you would be willing to accept. Anybody?
You said the supply is for, you remember the supply, it's not...
The water supply. So this is for reservoir reliability. Your storages in your reservoir are 1.2. That's a factor of safety. You still got 20%. But it's what they classify as a critical level. So below that, they consider themselves critically at risk. So reservoir. So anybody, any takers here? Feel free to just raise your hands. Okay. Keep them up. And I want all the hands in the room. Okay? All right. So first of all, there was a pretty reasonable differential across you all in a room of analysts. And so if we were to come in and recommend one solution, we'd probably all have recommended a different solution, which would be a tacit assumption of authority. The other thing is, Some of you are hesitant, asking good questions, because I think you have an innate question of whether or not these are the actual axes of the problem. Other factors, is there life loss? Are there other things? Are there things we're tacitly ignoring? One of the common responses I get when I do this exercise with utilities is they want to be up here. They want to suspend disbelief. And they also think that if our model fails, their system definitely fails more frequently than the model. So there's interesting things, but to come back to kind of Greg's talk, just differentiating between average cost and worst case cost, you get a totally different trade-off. And as you try to go down this axis, there's a lot of embedded risks. So my point is, not just understanding what multi-objective is, but there's a lot of tacit authority and preferences and assumptions that come into this. How you define the problem, how you operate the problem, how you present the problem. So, my team, we build geeky things. The geeky things are the red dots. We create algorithms that allow you to solve problems. This is an actual optimal trade-off surface that the algorithm doesn't know. Red is the algorithm. Why is this difficult mathematically? You got to converge, it's a sampling problem, through the space to not be worse than everything. And unlike most optimization, you have a second condition, which is diversity across the surface. And the two don't get along. You can do really well in convergence, but it hates diversity. Diversity hates convergence. And so you have to be clever in the math. And there's another thing, as you change the formulation, you start talking about other tacit assumptions or other extremes, the math gets more difficult. So the algorithm probably shouldn't fail. So downloading an SGA2, that's not sufficient condition. I can break that on the easiest test problem in the world. So, and we're geeky, and so this is a Star Trek reference. If you're not from the United States or you don't hit, they're a villain. And so their tagline is, "We will assimilate you." And the Borg strive for perfection. Why do we name our algorithm the Borg? Because actually it's not an algorithm, it's a framework. It instantiates and uses different exploration operators competitively. And if somebody, some mathematician in nowhere, USA, invents a new translation strategy, we will assimilate you.
Resistance is futile.
Exactly. And, well, that's even geekier. So, for the real geeky part of my group, one of the problems with getting these red dots to come from up here to down here, as you increase the number of objectives, is dominance resistance. It's like pulling a sail through the wind. And so, resistance is futile. Very geeky. And the name of my supercomputer at Penn State is the Cube, which is the Borg chip. So, yeah, I sustained this really bad. I actually got this into the peer review. But this is the other bad thing, is if you make millions to billions of dollars worth of decisions, I think one of the things we have to think about is how do we scalably actually use computing. It's not likely that a utility, although I have seen many larger utilities transitioning to their own in-house systems, is what is our role and how do we do this? And how do we test these questions in minutes instead of days, years, or in the latest versions of some problems that we're doing decades. So the other thing is communication. So these are the objectives in this system. This is another representation. So this is a line that represents a fully specified solution for the triangle. And you can see here, these are your objectives. You want to make it relatively easy to interpret. Down is good. Any movement up is bad. So your ideal solution would be a horizontal line across the bottom. It doesn't exist. And crossing lines represent trade-offs. And what you see here is that basically if you don't do anything, you get about an 8% failure rate, but you don't have to worry about your demand restrictions or all the financial implications. But if you want to increase your reliability, now you're starting to do really frequent restrictions. Your average costs go up, but this is what Greg was talking about, is that you have an instability in your financial costs. So you have really hard to predict fluctuations in your worst case costs across the system. So let's go back to those 4 different problems that we talked about. The status quo, which is doing what they do. And Greg showed this through kind of the volume view of his trade-offs. And this is just a different view of the same data. And the only thing I want you to consider here is not individual lines, but trends. Down is good. So you would like all the lines to go down. So this is just with restrictions, active restriction. This is when you pull in transfers. So you're increasing the efficiency of the system, the distribution of the resource in the system. But this is the part that often gets ignored, is that you then are increasing your financial risk, which is what Greg talked about one day. So this is making that more tangible, right? Explicit. So, and then the next issue is, well, what about if we do self-mitigation? So, and if I'm not mistaken, MWD is carrying, and Greg, maybe you can correct me, is something on the order of 900 million?
900 million was what I heard.
So, and they're okay with that, but there might be more efficient ways to do that. But one of the lessons in this is people are like, well, it's going up and down. Well, you can do this really well or really poorly. And then if you add the third-party insurance, it actually dampens the poorly. But then you're in a preference problem. So we have 4 competing hypotheses. So the question is, then we interviewed them what they thought their system was doing and should be doing. These are the conditions that they want. And then you superimpose, like Greg showed, and you turn off the first formulation, you turn off the second formulation, and only these show up. And within these, only a subset show up. So this is kind of scary, because what this means is if you don't formulate something, you don't solve the problem, actually. You may never get anything. And there's a lot of steps in that process, and that's why I think it's an iterative and constructive learning feedback. And it's pretty clear, transfers and financial instruments are required to get what they want, and they thought they were doing something that they weren't. So it's because they were modeling their systems with simple models deterministically, and it turned out they do very well in a deterministic perfect foresight world. But they don't live in one, so that's kind of problematic. So, did I just lie to you? I did my song and dance, trade-offs, everybody's happy, I sound like I'm smart. Well, what world did I just talk about? Is the world that they're going to actually be in the world that I just optimized to? Because the reality is, I only considered one uncertainty, well, that's hydrology. I didn't consider all these other uncertainties in terms of the way the region grows, the macroeconomics of the region. And this is a short-term study. It just gets more complicated from there. So, and this is where this coming in and reevaluating the stability of your trade-offs. You'd like these to be the same basic performance in a lot of different worlds. And that's not necessarily always true. So what are the decision-relevant consequences of choices we make when analyzing robustness? And one of the interesting things is, how does your preference actually change as you move from a well-specified version of the problem and what you would pick to then realizing that that doesn't work in 99 out of 100 alternate worlds? And what do you give up versus what do you accept in terms of your willingness to pay? And willingness to pay is not cash, it's multiple objectives. It's reliability, it's your financial risk, it's all these things. So if we think about this, there's lots of frameworks about robustness. And one of the challenging aspects of this is everybody wants to sell their recipe, but nobody wants to talk about the ingredients. And so one of the things that John Herman and I kind of got frustrated with is, let's break it down into the ingredients, and maybe we don't trust everybody's sell of the recipe. And so what do all these different frameworks that use the word robustness have in common? Well, they create either through human specification or algorithmic or other, some alternatives for action. They either tacitly or explicitly put those alternatives in some states of the world. They then define some level of acceptable robustness measure. That might be expected performance, it might be deterministic performance, it may be a satisficing, it may be any number of things. And then they may, so not doing sensitivity analysis is a form of sensitivity analysis. It says that there are no sensitivities. So, or if you do a linear system sensitivity, or you do a nonlinear system sensitivity, all has assumptions that are built in. So, not very clear on the board, but we created this taxonomy where our goal was to put every water system study in one diagram if we navigate it, which we more or less can do. To distill that out and not make this excruciatingly boring, you can bake this into a fairly simple point. What actions? What happens is a lot of what you hear is that we want more and more actions in complex portfolios. So the more actions that you put in, the more you shift towards rules, the less causal understanding that you have between action and consequence. It gets challenging. And so that's why sometimes people do optimization or other search techniques or a variety of things. The other question is, well, what world do you put it? So, and one of the questions, are you consistent? There are a priori approaches where you specify everything up front, and then there are a posteriori approaches where you don't specify everything up front, you discover what's important. That's both in terms of how you find actions and the world, before or after. And I'll give you an example. IPCC, right? Climate change. Is that a priori or a posteriori in how they define the futures of the world? What do you think? Did they define it before they know consequence or after? How many of you feel like the IPCC somehow drives some of the things that you do? So climate change kind of shows up. How many of you know what an RCP is? An SSP? An SPA? Shared policy assumptions. Shared socioeconomic pathways. Right? Representative concentration pathways. Those set a priori, right? Future worlds. Demographic futures, efficiency of industry, all of these things are defined in absence of consequence. They do perfect target finding to get an RCP of 8.5, which is basically a blow dryer in every square meter of Earth. What if it's an 8.3? How many paths are there to an 8.3? What's the intrinsic regret of your overinvestment if it's not 8.3 or 8.5 or 6.5? Right? It's best not to ask those questions, right? Because you'll make more in consulting. So, what world? So, a priori, the IPCC is that kind of case. You may not know it, but it's defined in absence of understanding consequence. There are other approaches I'll demonstrate here where you actually go through the space, you try to find consequence, and then you look for decision-relevant scenarios that hit triggers that you care about. That's a different approach. What's acceptable? That's an easy question. Who gets to define that? When do they define that? How long is it? How stable is it? How well known is it? You, the analyst, or your audience? Who is your audience? Do you go in with a magic dart that you threw on the wall and you go into a room full of people and you hope like hell it works? Or do you have a portfolio of options? What causes failure? This is another popular one to ignore. When? How? What did you assume? And so, you not doing these is the same as doing them. You're making a methodological choice. A deterministic model is a probabilistic model. It just has a very specific distribution. So if we move through this, just to illustrate a few fun examples of consequences of methodology. So, all right, so we think about this, the alternative generation. So we do this fancy, I showed you this fancy optimization. And we got the formulations 3 and 4 that had some alternatives that work, that survive. What I'm showing you here, this is a pre-specified solution. This represents the kind of restrictions that were the status quo in the Carolina system. Yellow is a robust solution from search, and blue is if you do, in addition to the search, you as the human impose a very responsive reduction in the demand growth of the system. What are we looking at here? You have reliability 99%, 95% to 100%, and you have a cumulative distribution, but what's different between this and what I showed you before? We had 13 other factors that were uncertain, and we put the solutions into 10,000 alternate worlds. So this is the percent of those alternate worlds where you meet this criteria, which is 99% reliability. And you can see in their original status quo that they're not robust in any form. High variance with the slope. The ideal would be a vertical line on this side. And as you do search, it does help, but it doesn't solve everything. And then you have an institutional question of how you actually do demand. What we haven't done is how they're going to do it, but we have highlighted that it's important that they do it. And then the other part is story similar or different on the other objectives. So you actually not only have trade-offs in the objectives, but you have trade-offs in the robustness and the sub-objectives. In this particular system, demand growth rate for the region, it's a very fast-growing region. That is a key factor. So you get a clear signal of what's important here. In addition, you need the transfers, you need the financial instruments. And being really robust on this axis has consequences in all the rest, if you don't consider them jointly. So this gets us states of the world question, an a priori versus a posteriori, assuming before you know consequence or after. So here's another fun one. Here are 10,000 alternate worlds, with each dot is a world. And in this case, green means you meet the 99% reliability, restriction frequency less than 20%, worst case loss 5%. Green is good. Green dots hit this. Gray, it doesn't. This is a proxy for kind of the standard climate change analyses, so your stream flow and your temperature-driven ET. Seeing pattern, this is a factor map. Let me see if you see a pattern here. So it depends on how you ask the question. So when you test things a priori that don't have any clear effect, they don't have any effect maybe. And if you assume that these are the most important factors a priori, and they're not, and you ignore this one, demand growth rate, you ignore this threshold. What does this mean? That means if you go above the status quo assumptions, you immediately go into a failure space with respect to how they define failure here. Either they need to relax this and become less averse across these criteria, or they need to really actively think about this. So, the rate of demand growth, it's not always popular to have this slide in certain audiences. So, the humans trump the hydrology in many systems. Shocking. How do you define what is acceptable? How do you go through this? What are the different approaches? What I just showed you actually is a satisficing definition that goes back to the early 1960s. And it's simple. What percent of the 10,000 worlds meet our condition? It's a multivariate condition. We had 3D things that had happened. Right? And I count them. Number of successes, number of failures. Here's a different one. Anybody know what this is reflective of? What methodology?
Okay.
Infogap. So it's on a horizon and you move through, right? And it's a different way of you define robustness. And you go through the horizon and how far do you go until you hit your first failure in that space. It's equally valid. It's another hypothesis for how you define robustness. This is a lot more conservative because it's going to hit that first failure that you sample. There are lots of others that you could do it. So, but this is basically a distance measure. These aren't all that exist, but they're representative of the different ones that exist that are commonly employed. There are different ways that you could do this. Regret-based. So deviation from the baseline state of the world, your best estimate of the world, how much does the system change? How much does the system change from its best possible value? Satisficing is what I just showed you, the percent of worlds. This is the uncertainty horizon, is the information gap. So how consistent are these? These become a way to navigate your trade-off surface and pick solutions that are quote-unquote robust. Do they pick the same solution? What do you think? So let's look at what solutions. You can't see this as well as I can, but you have an axis here, worst case cost, reliability, restriction frequency. The ideal solution would be here. This is the status quo solution. It jumped out of the volume. It's usually not this transparent, so it leaped out. And then here are your regret measures. They're out here. This is actually the info gap. And then this is the one that I showed you for this particular system, given the different ways that it interacts. Having multiple measures affecting your robustness moves you, but it's not to say that that's always true. My suggestion is to superimpose many definitions across a lot of different individuals to get the perspectives. And if you do that, each one has its own sensitivities. And so you get a sense. And now you're starting to see the trade-offs amongst the trade-offs. And one of the interesting questions is what would you choose in absence of these uncertainties versus what you choose in the presence of the definitions of robustness. You can measure the distances, the consequences, which is interesting. And so in this case, this is the criteria that we've been using in the Carolina system, the domain criteria. One of the interesting things is there are a lot of people that are experts in robustness that actually don't know anything about the other recipes because they only have one. And I would say we need to not think about recipes. I think every problem deserves its own set of ingredients. And then thinking about sensitivity analysis and moving through, there's all sorts of tools. How consistent are the tools? So this is what I just showed you, the factor mapping. This is one technique. It shows you a different version, but anything above 1 on this parameter causes failure. You can see that. There's different. You can have factor priority. You can map across all your parameters, all your objectives, your percent. You can look for consistency, so this is demand growth. Different sensitivity techniques have different assumptions and give you different potential flavors of results. Hypotheses, whether you acknowledge them or not. So, it's interesting. There's lots of complementary. So I would say there isn't one robustness technique. I think there's a suite of things to do, and there's a lot of potential to innovate, explore, bridge. So a few things from this first test case is that the pre-specified decision alternatives in this strongly biased. They did very, very poorly. But usually you don't have a volume of solutions and you say, hey, look how far you are from, you're worse than everything. Significantly. And then the more basic uncertainties that we added to it, the worse that got. And if you didn't do interesting things and you're not lucky enough to work with Greg's group and doing financial instruments and all of that, you may have boring decisions which give you boring results and trick you into false complacency. Robustness-based decision framework classified across these interchangeable ideas. It's plug and play, I would say, and we've been trying to work and making it where more is better. If you have some kind of creative technique or approach or thought process, we should all be embracing that. And then, this is the one that I'm a little bit annoyed by, is that there's a lot of assumed expertise. There's actually, anybody read the recent proceedings in National Academy, or there's another? Does expertise increase creativity or decrease it, as measured by psychologists? Systematically decreases creativity. So you got to be careful in this regard. And one of the interesting things is that actually there's a different side, is that the people in the utilities have a tremendous amount of expertise and creativity because they get fired when they do a poor job. Maybe on the academic side we should take that to heart a little bit. So this is section 1. I made this a little flexible. I have some other examples and interesting things. I'm happy to answer questions here, and then I could go into the other sections. Whatever people want, or I can proceed.
Well, just a general question, what is the reaction you got from the utility after presenting these faculties, the result?
So, well, the funny thing is, so particularly the trade-offs, like one of the examples was they had a rule, and the rule in the system kind of makes sense was that we cannot ask for a transfer until we put our system into restriction, because we don't want to tax other people until, but the reality is that makes everything worse, because that means that you don't act until the very last minute. And so what we did is we showed HB, we went back and used our parallel, and we showed that implementing that rule, everything leaks. And that got Greg invited to go give a briefing to their board because they hate that rule. Right? And so what they're excited about is different than what Greg and I are excited about, but the reality is, Greg, it took, 30 seconds for them to get excited about the parallel axes and even the robustness stuff. Some of the things we showed them is, like, not just robustness trade-offs, but when one player does well, the other players do very poorly. Shockingly, they're like, yeah, you just made that explicit, and they've been fairly cooperative. Now, that's in a fairly water-abundant context, very different social institution, and I don't think we face what, for example, Jay is facing in California in terms of highly expert interests in that regard. But they've been very positive, and to be honest, I have across these tools somewhere, in terms of the professional user groups, I think 10 consultancies that are actively using this or something similar to it. So I see it translating into practice.
But Pat, I think you should mention that with your analysis there, the revelation that they have a significant amount of control, more control than they thought, because if they can just reduce demand growth by a very small amount, not demand itself, but just growth, the rate of growth, they have a tremendous amount of control over how vulnerable their systems are.
That's true. And actually, one of the interesting things is, it wasn't even Greg and I that were prompting, but Raleigh's response was, well, what if we paid somebody else to do demand management? I'm like, well, that's an interesting question. So it changes the conversation. The other thing is, it's very similar to what Greg said. They don't believe it the first time they see it, and then the second time it's interesting, and by the third time they're asking really detailed, advanced questions. So, any other before I go to section 2? All right, so section 2, I'll try to be, well, I won't be trying. I'll be quick on this, so I'll apologize, but I thought I'd add some of this just because it's interesting. But language, other applications, and tools. So thinking about this, moving into section 1, how do you actually make these things explicit? How do you put the recipe into the taxonomy? I thought I'd show this. So what I just showed you is my group's mini-objective robust decision making. The example I just showed you, we did search with an optimization. It was multi-objective, and we only had one uncertainty at the beginning, which was the hydrology. Then we didn't assume a priori. We did a discovery. We added other factors that were potentially uncertain. And then, instead of assuming what was important, we looked for consequence. You see the demand growth leaped out, and it was an a posteriori scenario of discovery. What's acceptable? We did a satisficing definition, domain criterion, and it was multivariate. You had reliability, right? You had an average and worst case cost criteria. You could change those, you could increase them, you could reduce them. And some of the industrial applications of my tools, what they actually have is they have multiple people all doing the same analysis and then sharing the analysis with each other and arguing. Because actually it turns out they weren't even arguing over anything that could exist before. And then we did a combination of sensitivity analysis, both in terms of finding important ranges and ranking. Robust decision making in its original form. What is it typically done? How is it implemented? Typically with pre-specified alternatives, no search. So, a limited action space. But they do scenario discovery. This is what Rob Limpert made his meal ticket off of, largely. And I collaborate with Rob all the time, and he was actually a co-developer on RMO RDM. They do univariate, typically strongly economic measures of acceptability in most of their work. And as a consequence, they're maybe not watching what everything else is. And that's one of the reasons Rob was interested in chatting with us. And then they do ranges. Decision scaling. A priori. Typically. That's 9 out of 10 studies. Actually, climate factors are typically, this is changing in the latest studies, but it's an a priori system of assuming that you have temperature and precip. They also typically had, and now are changing beyond univariate definitions of robustness. So if you just look at the whole, I'm not saying it's all it's capable of, but this is the sum total of most of the work. And then in terms of sensitivity, they've moved to also doing ranges and ranking. Info gap, pre-specified, majority. Scenario discovery in a different style, right? In terms of the business measures, moving, and the way that you define it. Actually, this is wrong. It should be that last one. And no sensitivity analysis is typical of this. And it's not to say one is better, but I think it's always good to be explicit. Because what happens is people argue, hey, my recipe can do that. Well, your recipe didn't do that because you didn't do that as part of your ingredient. Moving on to a couple other interesting examples, just to show that this isn't necessarily only a water problem in the water supply context. How many of you have ever heard of DICE? Probably not, right? It's an integrated assessment model. How many of you have ever heard of the social cost of carbon? So that's basically the damages by emitting CO2. How many of you heard that the U.S. is considering actually the social cost of carbon for new federal regulations for the Environmental Protection Agency, which will affect the entire U.S. economy? So DICE is used for that. It's one of the models. How many of you have ever heard of Bill Nordhaus or the Nordhaus-Stearns debate? This model. This is Nordhaus's model. This is one of the lead models in the global debate on the degree that we should be actively mitigating climate. So, in this economic model, it is arguably formulated by one of the most famous environmental economists in the world, Bill Nordhaus. And he does a macroeconomic utility transformation of global welfare, which means you have a rational agent at the global scale. And it's looking at how they have the preference of how you are going to optimize the world's mitigation of climate. It's that point. Are you happy with that? Do you feel like you were consulted in this process? So this is the recommendation, the macroeconomic utility function that abstracts every human on Earth and every consequence on Earth. So it's interesting, just using the same model. If we're going to change the global economy, do we want to do it reliably? Or do we want to do it deterministically? let's add just a shallow sampling of deep uncertainties. Right? So we have the second objective, reliability. So that's tacitly ignored in the way that the policy debate is formulated. So, reliability, up is good in this case. You'd like to have more reliability. In this case, this is optimizing the utility. What if we make it a bit more transparent? And abatement cost and consumption, these are the inputs to the utility function. Different countries see themselves in different sections of this curve with different consequences. And this is the original tacit preference, superimposed. So, and as you move, there might be some issues. One of the scary parts of this is we barely sampled the uncertainty. We just considered uncertainty and climate sensitivity, no other parameter. And we only did it for one distribution, not the 48 hours. But just to illustrate who makes this compromise and what are the issues. Damages, abatement costs, you're shifting in terms of the global players, who is living with climate change directly versus who has to pay for it. So, what's my point here? Sometimes I didn't change the model per se, we just tweaked a little bit of how the inputs are transformed and showed it more explicitly with a little bit of our multi-objective optimization under uncertainty. So this shifts kind of your perception, or at least makes explicit the tacit analyst preferences. That's one. So this is kind of interesting, but you transition in this case, right? The decision analysts are can be dangerous. So it's always good to make them show what they've embedded with their preferences, especially since the whole global economy might be involved. Here's another one. This is a classic. So, Van Danzig, if you don't know, this is when the Dutch actually really started seriously considering Dijk. This is a beautiful, classic decision theory model. And it's very simple optimization. What Dijk, global sea level rise, storm surge, it's this mixture of economics and engineering, incredibly elegant in the 1950s. So this is a fun didactic example. Let's go back and look at a classic. So this is standard kind of cost benefit analysis. You have your Dijk height increases here in meters, expected cost, million guilders. You have here, in essence, your expected damages, you have your investment cost, you have the original approach. That's the optimal answer. It was solved as a deterministic model. 2.35 meters for this particular case study. So what if we add parametric uncertainty just for the original model? So we add that 5 centimeters. It turns out you don't get to put it just on the top. You got to go from the bottom. So 5 centimeters is about $43 million. But this is a very, again, shallow sampling of the uncertainty. So what if we work with Klaus Keller, who is an expert in climate risk and storm surge, and Chris Forrest, and we say, hey, why don't you look at the problem? Well, this is the updated uncertainty sea level rise. That's pretty substantial increase. What about uncertainty, structural uncertainty? So you use Markov chain Monte Carlo methods, and the state of the art of the science is understanding of storm surge. Long tail distributions, 4.25 meters. Catastrophic failure. We could do this in trade-off space. Fun with trade-offs. So here we have the original Van Danzig built-in trade-off, deterministic. This is the optimal solution. If we convert all this probabilistic space and only make the decision off the average trade-off, it would be this line. This is the single objective net present value optimally. And what you have here is you have likelihood. So red things, you have a high likelihood that an investment will not give you the performance. This is breach. So, to get to Jay's question, in this case, reliability has a pretty severe definition. So you have this, and so if you use mean-centric decision theory, you're in trouble in this regard, because this really doesn't adequately necessarily account for your residual. The other interesting thing is, hey, as you optimize your cost, look at the variability explosion. So, and this doesn't look bad, but let's zoom on a log scale. Your net present value solution has a giant residual. So you make this decision, but you have all of this residual risk. It has catastrophic effect. So one of the questions that this gets back to is, how do you define your objectives? Because if you do it in the mean, you're ignoring this residual risk. But if you go to the residual risk, you have a high potential opportunity cost for regret.
This is really neat. It's really fortunate that the Dutch result ended up with a 1 in 10,000 year event.
So actually what the Dutch have done is they've abandoned the 1 in 10,000, because what they realized is they had to abandon that. Because every decade, when they recalculated the probability, it was fundamentally different. And so now they have room for the river, and they also have the dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach, where they've created basically options in the future and a $1 billion account every year to give them the ability to shift their policy, because they consider the levy approach a lock-in and a failure.
I think the other aspect of the Dutch experience with this and the tremendous success of it was it allowed them to make a decision.
Right. So, and one of
So that the real value of the approach was not in that it gave you the optimal result, but it gave you a result that allowed you to make a decision this decade rather than next decade.
Yeah. And that's one of the things, is the success became the fatigue, is because the approach kept giving you a new answer, which then gave you a new decade of changing to that. And now they're saying, since we're already changing, let's put the pathway into the plan. So the idea is, it's not that it's necessarily bad, but I think one of the problems is that this often gets held up as an example, but they themselves, the folks that I know, Jan Kwakkel, Mara Line, the folks that are actually doing their new flood planning, this bothers them, and they're trying to deal with this in a sustainably, institutionally capable way that, in my opinion, is largely only Dutch, because they're willing to put $1 billion in the bank every year towards this. But it's an interesting question, how you do decision theory. So with that, I'll leave it about it 9 minutes. Happy to answer other questions. But the only other things is, we have tools we're happy to share. The more the merrier. I believe in collaboration and learning from smart people. This is openware.